Welcome to the Public Housing Repositioning Post-Closing How-To video series. The goal of this video series is to help explain and discuss common issues that occur post-closing after repositioning public housing assets to voucher assistance. Each video provides quick guidance to public housing agencies, PHAs, that are new to or unfamiliar with Rental Assistance Demonstration, RAD, and/or Project-Based Voucher, PBV, program requirements. The videos will help PHAs better understand their asset management and reporting responsibilities post-repositioning. The goal of this video is to explain the required tenant rent phase-in process. While some videos in this series highlight program features that are applicable to both RAD PBVs and non-RAD PBVs, this video describes requirements only applicable to RAD PBVs and any non-RAD PBV units located in the same covered project. This video covers the basic requirements that PHAs must follow during a RAD conversion to establish a tenant rent phase-in process. Families' rents may increase when the property converts from public housing to PBV under RAD. This affects mainly families previously paying a flat rent, since they do not have a choice between paying an income-based rent or a flat rent in the PBV program. RAD has statutory waiver authority that allows for greater flexibility in determining a tenant's contribution to rent than what is required in the standard PBV program. PHAs that convert to PBV through RAD must establish a policy to phase in tenant rent increases that result purely from the conversion under RAD. Affected families' rent increases will be phased in over a period of 3 or 5 years. Creating a phase-in policy. A PHA must create an administrative plan policy setting the length of the phase-in period at 3 years, 5 years, or a combination depending on circumstances. For example, a PHA may create a policy that uses a 3-year phase-in for smaller increases in rent and a 5-year phase-in for larger increases in rent. The PHA must communicate its policy in writing to affected residents. This policy must be in place at conversion and may not be modified after conversion. Applying a phase-in policy. The phase-in applies to tenants where, purely as a result of RAD conversion, the amount that tenant would pay for rent and utilities under the PBV program increases by more than the greater of 10% or $25. To clarify, the rent increase needs to be related solely to the RAD conversion. There may be instances where a household's rent increases around the same time as a RAD conversion, but for other reasons. For example, a rent phase-in would not apply in the following scenarios. If the rent increase occurs because of new household income, the rent phase-in does not apply. Or if the household has come to the end of their earned income disregard or EID period and their rent increases, the phase-in does not apply. But a rent phase-in does apply in the following scenarios, since the increase is related solely to the RAD conversion. The phase-in would apply in a case where the household was on flat rent while in public housing, and by moving to income-based rent as a result of the RAD conversion, the tenant rent increases. The phase-in also applies if the tenant moves to a new unit because of the RAD conversion where the rent is higher, then the phase-in does apply. Now back to our example. The phase-in would apply in this scenario. Your resident's most recently paid rent and utilities is $100, but the calculated PBV total tenant payment, TTP, which is most often equal to 30% of adjusted gross income, comes to $300. First, the PHA determines which is greater, 10% of the most recently paid rent and utilities or $25. In this case, 10% of $100 is $10, so $25 is the greater amount. So $25 will be the applicable amount to determine if the family's rent must be phased in. Next, the PHA determines if the increase to the tenant payment will be more than the applicable amount. In this case, the tenant payment is increasing from $100 to $300, an increase of $200. This is well above the $25 threshold, so the family qualifies for a phase-in. For these tenants, the rent increase will be phased in over 3 or 5 years, whatever is specified in the PHA's administrative plan. The phase-in gradually increases the family's rent and utility costs from the pre-conversion TTP, or, if a family was paying a flat rent immediately prior to RAD conversion, the flat rent amount. The PHA begins increasing the family's share at the first recertification, or year 1 following conversion. In either the 3-year phase-in or the 5-year phase-in, once the rent increases in each year are equal to the calculated PBV TTP, the phase-in ends and tenants pay the full TTP from that point forward. You may be wondering, who pays the difference during the phase-in period? The difference between the phased-in amount and contract rent is covered by the Housing Assistance Payment, HAP, during the phase-in period. 3-year phase-in. The method described here explains the percentages you must use if you are implementing a 3-year phase-in. Later in the video, we will walk through a specific example with rent amounts to demonstrate what a resident might pay each year. Calculated PBV, TTP, refers to the TTP calculated by the PHA in accordance with regulations at 24 CFR 5.628. Most recently paid TTP refers to the TTP recorded on the family's most recent HUD form 50058. At any annual or interim recertification following RAD conversion performed prior to the second annual recertification after conversion, the resident's contribution increases by 33% of the difference between the calculated PBV TTP and the most recently paid TTP, or flat rent if a family was paying a flat rent immediately prior to conversion. At the second annual or interim recertification, the resident's contribution increases by 50% of the difference between the calculated PBV TTP and the most recently paid TTP. At the third annual recertification, the resident's contribution increases to the full calculated PBV TTP. 5-year phase-in. And here we show what the percentage increase looks like across a 5-year phase-in. Again, later in the video, we will walk through a specific example with rent amounts to demonstrate what a resident might pay each year. At any annual or interim recertification performed prior to the second annual recertification following RAD conversion, the resident's contribution would increase by 20% of the difference between the calculated PBV TTP and the most recently paid TTP, or flat rent if a family was paying a flat rent immediately prior to conversion. At the second annual or interim recertification, the resident's contribution increases by 25% of the difference between the calculated PBV TTP and the most recently paid TTP. At the third annual or interim recertification, the resident's contribution increases by 33% of the difference between the calculated PBV TTP and the most recently paid TTP. At the fourth annual or interim recertification, the resident's contribution increases by 50% of the difference between the calculated PBV TTP and the most recently paid TTP. And in the 5th and final year of the phase-in, the resident will pay the full calculated PBV TTP. Example scenarios. We will now walk through 2 example scenarios and show what the resident's contribution might look like under a 3-year and then a 5-year phase-in. For both examples, we assume the following. The TTP at RAD conversion is $100, and the calculated PBV TTP at conversion is $300. The difference of $200 is more than the greater of 10% of the TTP at RAD conversion, which is $10, or $25, so a phase-in is required. In this example, the family's calculated PBV TTP stays at $300 over all 5 years, but in reality, TTPs may fluctuate. If the family's calculated PBV TTP changes at a recertification, each year the PHA increases the rent by a percentage of the difference between the most recently paid TTP and the currently applicable calculated PBV TTP, not the calculated PBV TTP at conversion. In other words, if the family's income rises during the phase-in period, the phase-in continues by the prescribed percentage difference between the most recently paid TTP and the calculated PBV TTP. It is important to note that if the family's income falls during the phase-in period, such that the calculated PBV TTP falls below the amount that would otherwise be the phased-in rent, the family pays the calculated PBV TTP and the phase-in ends. Some families may have multiple interim recertifications during a year, but the rent phase-in will only be applied once per year. The following slides show what a 3- and 5-year phase-in would look like for residents as they transition from paying $100 to $300 each month. Example: 3-year phase-in. The family continues paying the most recently paid TTP until the first recertification, year 1, at which point the phase-in begins. If you have a 3-year phase-in period, the family will pay $166 in year 1, starting with the first recertification, then $233 in year 2, and then the full $300 in year 3. Start with the calculated PBV TTP, which is $300, and subtract the most recently paid TTP or flat rent. For example, in year 1, this is $100, so the difference is $200. Then, apply the phase-in percentage for that year to the difference. So 33% of $200 is $66. So the household will pay the $100 plus the phase-in amount of $66. This is a total of $166 in year 1. In year 2, the TTP will increase by another $67, and the household will pay $233. In year 3, the TTP increases by another $67, and the household pays the full calculated PBV TTP of $300. This is one possible approach your PHA can adopt. The other is to use a 5-year phase-in. Example: 5-year phase-in. If your PHA has a 5-year phase-in period, the family will pay $140 in year 1, then $180 in year 2, then $220 in year 3, followed by $260 in year 4, and then the full $300 in year 5. The standard calculation is the same as the 3-year phase-in. The only difference is the phase-in percentage that applies each year. Start with the calculated PBV TTP, which is $300, and subtract the most recently paid TTP or flat rent. For example, in year 1, this is $100, so the difference is $200. Then, apply the phase-in percentage for that year to the difference. So 20% of $200 is $40. So the household will pay the $100 plus the phase-in amount of $40. This is a total of $140 in year 1. Over the next 4 years, the household will pay an additional $40 each year until they reach the full $300 in year 5. These 2 examples are based on simple assumptions that the household's income stays the same throughout the full 3- or 5-year period. In reality, household income often fluctuates. Keep in mind, every PHA needs to have a phase-in policy if you are doing a RAD conversion. You have a choice to use a 3-year or 5-year phase-in or a combination. PHAs must update their PHA administrative plan to reflect your chosen phase-in process. An MTW agency must also implement a 3- or 5-year phase-in, but may alter the terms if it establishes a written policy setting forth the alternative terms. To facilitate the uniform treatment of residents and units at a covered project, any non-RAD PBV units located in the same covered project shall be subject to the terms of the phase-in provision. The phase-in does not apply to units repositioned solely through Section 18 or streamlined voluntary conversion. However, the phase-in does apply to the RAD and non-RAD units in a RAD Section 18 blend. Some PHAs may have a business system that does not allow for rent phase-in. If this is the case, work with your business software provider as soon as possible. HUD understands that rent phase-in may be difficult for some providers.